Hi, I'm Aloysius Uche Ordu, Director of the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution and host of Foresight Africa podcast. I wanted to share with you today the recording of an important conversation I just moderated on tackling climate change in Africa. The Africa Growth Initiative hosted this event on Earth Day, a special day, as part of the ongoing Foresight Africa event series. In this event, expert panelists focused on energy transition, on local action, on climate finance, on the role of parliamentarians, on the role of Africa's youths, and the hopes for COP27, Africa's COP, to be held in Egypt later in 2022. Please stay tuned for our regular schedule of Foresight Africa podcast interviews and learn more at brookings.edu/Foresight Africa podcast. Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to Brookings Africa Growth Initiative. I'm Aloysius Uche Ordu, Director of the Africa Growth Initiative. In the nation's capital this week, there are many meetings on the sidelines of the IMF and the World Bank spring meetings. We're particularly delighted that you chose instead to spend this morning with us. Today is, of course, a special day, Earth Day, when investment in our planet is the theme of the day. It's therefore most appropriate that we at the Brookings AGI chose today to launch the climate chapter of Foresight Africa 2022. Every year since 2011, AGI has published Foresight Africa to highlight the key priorities for Africa in the year ahead. The themes for this year cover Africa's recovery from the pandemic, health systems, empowering our women and girls, tackling the global crisis facing us, the climate crisis, technological revolution, and Africa's integration with itself and with the rest of the world. Our authors include heads of states, policymakers, parliamentarians, captains of industries, and Africa's youths. And 50% of our authors are women, which we're very, very proud about. Despite the global uncertainties and the challenges facing Africa, our message in this year's Foresight remains an optimistic one. The continent has demonstrated a capacity to weather storms against all odds. And we're hoping that Africa will continue to be resilient in the face of the current challenges in the global economy. To discuss the climate challenge in particular on this Earth Day, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panelists. First is Dr. Mahmoud Muheldin. He's the Executive Director for Egypt at the International Monetary Fund. Mahmoud is also the UN Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Agenda. He was a former Managing Director of the World Bank Group. Second is Honorable Janine Mabunda, Member of Parliament for Bumba and former President of the National Assembly, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. She also authored an excellent viewpoint in this year's Foresight Africa. The third is Mr. Yombi Morris, a climate activist, Fridays for Future Uganda, and we're absolutely delighted to have him representing the youth voice for our continent. We also have Mr. Paul Okwi, who's a Senior Program Specialist, International Development Research Center in Nairobi, Kenya. And last but not the least, my co-host and partner in crime, Dr. Ede Ijaz Vasquez. Ede is a non-resident senior fellow with us at the Brookings AGI. He was a former director of infrastructure, director of sustainable development at the World Bank Group. I bid you all a warm welcome. Ede, over to you.
Thank you, Aloysius, and thank you to everybody who is joining us today. Climate change is one of the defining factors for the African continent today and in years and decades to come. Now, despite some progress in the sharing and dealing with climate change, COP26 in Glasgow, we believe that it didn't push forward the world and getting on track to successfully tackle climate change. I mean, there were many positive areas. For example, Glasgow kept the 1.5 warming goal alive. And now the countries have been asked to come to Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 with even more ambitious national development contributions and NDCs. There was a new agreement for global carbon trading that is such an important tool to tackle climate change. And there were a variety of agreements in terms of phasing out coal power, in terms of slashing methane emissions that are so harmful, and in terms of pledging to end deforestation by 2030. Now, on the other hand, the developed countries failed to reach the $100 billion annual commitment that they have made in Paris to have achieved by 2020. And unfortunately, the current commitments only bring us to about a warming trajectory of 2.4 degrees centigrade. The discussion on climate loss and damage, meaning what damage is caused by climate change and which party should pay for it, it made some progress, but there's still a lot of discussion, and we're counting on COP27 to move into that process. Because the evidence on the urgency to tackle this has been made clear and patently clear by the recent reports from IPCC that have been coming out in the last few months. And in Africa, look, life-threatening temperatures of more than 40 degrees centigrade are projected to increase by 10 to 140 days a year, depending on the scenario and the region. And the region is going to see a lot more drier conditions, but unusually they're going to have more floods and more droughts. And therefore, those shocks are going to be impacting economies, livelihoods, societies, and lives all around the continent. And so it is really imperative that the largest emitters take decisive action to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. And Africa's historical and current emission of greenhouse gases, particularly per capita, are minimal. Still, the region suffered the most impacts on climate change and the most severe consequences. Now, but even if the world still remains within 1.5 degree warming, Africa will need to adapt urgently to the new realities of a rapidly changing climate. And therefore, the developed world recognized that, and the Glasgow Accord does urge developed countries to double the collective provision of climate finance for adaptation to developing countries to double from the 2019 levels by 2025. And that's going to be an important change. And that is really critical, especially for Africa. And an important message of Foresight and the climate section is to say adaptation is not necessarily a cost. Growth that incorporates adaptation brings a triple dividend. Economies can become more efficient and more productive. The impact on lives and livelihoods will be reduced, and the environmental benefits of those actions will be significant. Now, COP27, the Africa COP, is really a unique opportunity to accelerate progress in climate action and to mobilize the partnerships needed for Africa's rapid, inclusive, green, and resilient development. So it is for that reason that it is such a pleasure and honor for us to have Dr. Mohedin in this panel. And really, the eyes of the world are in COP27, and you have a clear leadership role to make it a success. This is the Africa COP. And therefore, how to make sure that COP27 raises the ambition, and more importantly, the action on climate change in the continent. So tell us a little bit about the current vision and the plan for COP27. What is the COP27 presidency going to ask the world to do in partnership with Africa? Give us a sense of the excitement that Egypt is going to bring to this new COP.
Right. Thank you so much, Eddie. Many thanks to you as well, Aloysius, for your introductory remarks and the kind invitation. And before I start, let me congratulate you and our colleagues in Brookings for very substantive contributions to our knowledge and understanding of what's happening in climate change with the focus on Africa. I refer here to your joint piece on climate change, tackling the global challenge, from which, Eddie, you picked some of the main findings. like as well to congratulate another panelist with her piece on addressing Africa's dual challenges, climate change and electricity access. Ms. Lioko and her work. She's actually highlighting many of the challenges, but as well, she's providing a great deal of opportunities to deal with matters if we are getting our act together. I think your assessment, Eddie, on Glasgow is a fair one. In a world of second or perhaps third best, people are perhaps are just happy to have the COP, and there could be the summary of the outcomes as highlighted by the Financial Times during Glasgow, or after that, directly after Glasgow, that Glasgow reached what could be considered as better than expected, but less than hoped. In all aspects of the activities, there have been some sort of progress, better than expected, but again, the hopes are much higher than what had been delivered, given the concerns of the scientific community. And actually, you don't need just to read the IPCC report to be concerned, like the few report that came out during the last few weeks, telling us that we are not on target for the 1.5 degrees. That if you take the 2030 rather than the 2050 or the 2060 trajectories, you'll be seeing that the world is increasing emissions by 14%, instead of lowering them by 45%. So you can really see this kind of drifting or great deviation from target. And this means that the mitigation efforts need to be enhanced and we need more investments in them. The second aspect of work, adaptation, that you mentioned, and it was reflected as well in your joint piece. Adaptation for many years had been neglected for a variety of reasons. One, because of a generous assumption that the world is going to be doing a better job in mitigation, so you don't need to have any kind of adaptation efforts, which is proven wrong. Second, that the models and the scenarios that have been put forward to deal with adaptation didn't really give good opportunities for public-private partnerships, unlike the cases of mitigation. Perhaps on the adaptation side, you'll see that most of the projects have public benefits than private benefits. So here, you would be expecting that public finance, either from domestic sources or from international sources, should really be taking the lead. But I cannot really deal with this issue on climate preparations and the COP without really putting matters in the context, because your joint piece back in January was put in a completely different world as well from the one that we're living in. It was really challenging then, but it is more challenging now, especially after the Ukraine war. Food, fuel, financial challenges, and scarcity of fertilizers. Those 4 Fs are really having a disproportionate impact on the African continent. As you know, the food share of or the weight of food in the consumer price index is with an average of 40% in the African continent. With countries like South Africa could be less than 20%, but countries like South Sudan or Angola, that weight or share could be even more than 60%. So when we say food challenges and food prices, this has really an impact, not just on the food cost at the country level, but at the household level. The fuel prices had increased, and there is very little room on the budgets to provide any kind of decent subsidies. And the financial challenge, when you see that debt to GDP ratios have increased by 70% since 2014. So, and you add to that, to the fertilizers, this will raise some question marks about food production and food security. So basically within this context, and the multilateral system that had been very much challenged because the war in the Ukraine had been impacting a great deal the multilateral institutions. And you see, it's not a secret that there are many tensions because of that, even within the apolitical organization, like the one that you and I worked in, like the World Bank or the IMF, where I served on the board representing a group of countries, including Egypt. So this is basically the political and the economic context. But here, this is the challenge, but the opportunities are huge at the same time. And I can really identify very quickly the following. I would expect COP27 to address climate change through a holistic approach to sustainable development. When you talk about climate change and managing the transition, for me, and everybody who worked on SDGs for quite some time, this is basically about operationalization of the SDGs. Climate change, at the end of the day, it's SDG 13, but any kind of decent work in dealing with mitigation, it's basically availing electricity, it's SDG 7. Dealing with adaptation is SDG 6 with water. You cannot do anything and you harm the poor more, SDG 1. You cannot really do climate and compromise our already compromised position in nutrition and malnutrition, SDG 2. So, and inequality as measured by gender and by SDG 10, SDG 5 and SDG 10 need really to be put into consideration. A striking figure that came out from a recent speech by the Secretary General of the UN when he was addressing the Women Conference just a few weeks ago, when he say when it comes to disasters and harms to cities or dwellings, and you worked a lot in this area, Eddie, he says that women and girls are 14 times more likely to be impacted negatively by that kind of harm or shocks to systems or to dwellings and where we live in. So the holistic approach is not a luxury. It's not just the sake of being comprehensive or know-it-all kind of thing, but basically managing the transition is key. And we saw that even advanced economies, OECD countries, when they fail to manage the transition, many people can blame it on Ukraine or COVID, but actually there have been many fundamental problems because of mismanagement of the transition, including in the energy sector. We saw that the fuel mix had increased in Europe from March to September by roughly 75 to 80%, even before Ukraine. So here, issues related to managing the transition, phasing out properly, phasing in renewables and alternatives, seeing the impact on the communities is basically, I would say, it's a common sense approach that should be adopted. Second, that we need to ensure that to move away from pledges, announcements, and commitments to implementation and actions in the field. We have been getting a lot of claims, big announcements of love of the planet and the people, and putting all of these announcements. But when it comes to delivery, there is a lot to be desired. So here we need really to be focused on the projects. If it is a good idea, makes sense, let's projectize it. Let's see those pipelines of projects. Now, with the $130 trillion committed by the asset managers during the Glasgow through the GFANs, they say, well, we are ready, but just give us a couple of things, rule of law, and give us a project pipeline of relevance to, especially to mitigation and net zero, and a business environment that we can work within. Well, and some sort of macroeconomic stability as well. Well, we cannot really wait for all of that to happen, but at least if we can really have the project pipeline with some sort of good arrangements for these projects and provide them through the relevant lines. And I'm encouraging here the African Development Bank, the IFC of the World Bank Group, the Economic Commission of Africa to help in the technical assistance that could be required for the African countries. You may have a project that needs to be enhanced by funding. This is an opportunity. You may have a new idea that could be really provided. This is another way of doing it. I would go very quickly, mindful of the time. As you put it in your reports, compliance with the 1.5 degrees annual target, that's very much needed. And you put it right. Even if we are at 1.5 degrees, where we stand to be harmed. So we need to invest a lot in adaptation. So here, this gets us to call for adaptation technologies. And it's great that in your piece, you didn't just mention finance. It's an issue of technology. In the case of mitigation, now why we can afford it. While some African countries are great now in doing their solar plants, like what we see in Egypt and Morocco, because the technology and the investments at scale had managed to reduce the cost of production by 95% during the last 10 years. We need to do more perhaps on the wind, but solar is getting there. Technologies in adaptation require this kind of investments, and the partnerships with the scientific community, with academics, and with research centers and the business sector is very much required here. Building capacity in climate change action. You raised this, Eddie, and in your joint piece with Aloysius, and I congratulate you for this, because sometimes we just say, yes, let's build something, and then we don't really know who will be the beneficiaries. If it is going to be ministries of environment or ministries of local development, it's fine, you can build the capacity. But if it is a holistic approach, it has to be a whole of society approach. As you know, there are a couple of initiatives by the UN, for instance, to build an early warning system for multi-purpose. Here you can build that system, but if you don't really have the adequate response from the society, here you will just wasting money and resources. So it's basically about building capacity for response. And then we need really to establish further the understanding of how a global carbon market can work with benefits for the African countries. Yes, our emissions are between 3 to 4%. But the damage to our society and our economies is between 2 to 0.5% of GDP. Having a kind of a carbon market is great, but I like just to say here between brackets, having a carbon market and a carbon price, unlike many people are thinking, is not a panacea in itself. It's not a silver bullet. It's essential, but you cannot really have a reductionist approach by sustainability to mean only climate, and climate to be only meaning mitigation, and mitigation to be only meaning carbon pricing. Back again to this holistic approach, I would really put that carbon market development within that context. And then let me finalize what I'm saying. You would be expecting me, given our work together, that will be speaking about finance and investment. How are you going to be funding all of that? And you already mentioned this. The $100 billion, the promise of Copenhagen, hadn't been delivered so far. Yes, there had been some improvement last year, and the argument by some independent panels saying that we could be close to 80% of the 100 billion. But again, at the same time, you see folks and colleagues like in Oxfam saying, no, it's not 80%, it's less than 25%. So here, I think one of the things that could be delivered in Sharm, that we need really to have some sort of transparency and disclosure about what we're talking about. As you know, in Copenhagen, it used to be assumed like those funds are going to be only public finance. But now everything that is being coming from the north to the south, or from advanced to developing, is being considered as part of the 100 billion. Even with the stretching of the definition, we're not reaching it. And there is a great deal of discrepancy on methodology. This is very much essential, Eddie, because we need to finalize this in the coming years, because 2025, when we have the new targets and the new pledges, we need really to be more accurate in what we're talking about, regardless of the figure that we're going to be agreeing on. Comes to that as well, the issue, very controversial, damage and loss. As you know, that had been subject to a very big debate, and some countries are arguing that this should be part of adaptation. It is fair to consider it as a completely different file, but you would expect some serious discussions about the loss and damage in Sharm el-Sheikh, given the emphasis on developing economies, including, of course, African economies. Lots of work is expected from the business sector and the private finance sector. I already mentioned the GFANs, how to translate those $130 trillion of assets into flows of funds. It's basically about projects, incentives, and monitoring. And I'm very optimistic that some good work that could come from that newly established committee led by the former Minister of Environment and Climate from Canada, Ms. McKenna, that has been just formed by the UN Secretary General. They are going to be verifying what we claim to be relevant of ESG, the environment, social, and governance criteria, So this committee is going to be responsible for verification, for procedures, for codes, for standards for us to be followed. Because when we encourage the private sector to be engaged, we need really to have some sort of better standards, at least to minimize the confusion and minimize the greenwashing issues of concern. I spoke about debt, and I think it's not really fair to ask developing economies to borrow to fix some other people's kind of damage to the economies and societies. As much as we can really get more grants, more concessional support, and definitely debt reduction mechanisms. Perhaps this could be an area of work. I'm encouraging you with your colleagues to work on debt reduction mechanisms, including through debt swaps. There are debt to climate swaps, debt to nature swaps, and they have been exercised, as you know, in Costa Rica in the past, and then more recently in Seychelles and in Belize. But what we need is more of scaling up in these methods. Having said that, what we require then to have, as you can see, it's a very big and rich agenda waiting for us. I can see, given that I work closely, as you know, with this climate champion function that I'm conducting with colleagues for this COP27, the current presidency is dividing the substantive outputs of the conference of the parties into three main tracks. One, as you know, the multilateral negotiating track. Good luck with that. It's going to be tough negotiations, especially with Article 6 and the issues related to loss and damage. Second, the presidency initiatives framework is going to be shared, and we put 17 possible themes, from just investments to transparency to gender equity. That list is going to be shared soon, covering all aspects of mitigation, adaptation, and managing the transition. There is something as well that you will in particular will be happy with, and I know that you have very big program in cities and localization. There's going to be an emphasis on localization of efforts and activities with impact on SDGs as well. Then the third and final part in the course of the internationally endorsed projects to implement adaptation, mitigation, or financing projects, especially in the African continent, are going to be enhanced through this issue of matchmaking between the suppliers of funds and the demanders of them for projects that could be not just aligned with the Paris Agreement, but with the SDGs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And I really want to emphasize some of the points that you made, because I think that perspective that climate cannot be separate from the SDGs, that integrality is fundamental for Africa, I think is one message that is not very common. And I know that in your leadership role, this is going to become more central and it's very much needed. The focus on really projects and actions rather than on promises, I think is a refreshing change. I think that if COP27 really forces pipelines of projects, forces changes in the environment to be able to get those projects financed and realized, is going to be really a change of tone that would be welcome in the COP process. And then finally, your work on finance is going to be very interesting. I think that all of your ideas that you threw like darts in a storm is just fantastic, and we're so glad that you are in that leadership role as COP champion for COP27. So and look, in these few minutes, you just were able to cover such a broad spectrum of issues that I think we are very lucky to be able to see the process from here to Sharm el-Sheikh in what is a very difficult environment. And I want to close by saying those 4 F crises: food, fuel, finance, and the sorry, I forgot the 4th one, fertilizers. I don't want to think what happens if you had 4 F crises and then the regular climate shocks that Africa happens. And then you're going to have the floods and the droughts and the food crisis that they come with them, the impact on livelihoods. And then you have a huge impact, a huge climate shock on top of food crisis. So I think the continent and the world as a whole needs to be ready for that contingency altogether. Aloysius, back to you.
Ede, thank you. Thank you very much. And Mahmoud, that's really, thank you very, very much for the, chapeau you provided us. Gratefully appreciated. Now, I'd like to turn to Honorable Janine Mabunda, from the global to the national and regional level. As we mentioned earlier at the beginning, Madam Mabunda also authored one of the viewpoints in this year's Foresight, which I really encourage people to read. The question is really, how is climate change impacting your home country of Congo DRC? What is the current, if you like, response of the Congolese government and society at large to face the enormous challenges of climate that we have just been talking about? And how should the realities on the ground in the DRC shape the global responses, some of which we heard Mahmoud articulate earlier on?
Thank you, and I will join the other speakers to commend Brookings for his tremendous and deep work regarding this conversation on the climate change and how Africa's voice should be heard in it. And I will not go back on some of the issue that has been raised by my predecessor, but we all have this deep willingness to see that Africa is on the map on this conversation, because Africa is basically the game changer in that conversation. And that's very important to be said, to be stressed, and to be heard. If I can take the example of DRC, how climate change is impacting on DRC, and how should the day-to-day life and the reality on the ground in the DRC shape this global response, I would say that yes, we have all seen that the world is boiling, the world is hot, especially now under this war pressure. And in addition of all this elevated threat, we see that the climate consequences in Africa and in DRC are really there, whether it's for drought or extreme weather because of this climate change. And DRC will face many pressure, environment pressure, social and governance pressure related to the increased demand, for example, for cobalt and other critical minerals. You know that in this conversation about how should we tackle the climate issue, we want all to migrate to more use of clean energy. And for clean energy and for electrical vehicle, there is what they call the energetic mineral, strategic minerals. And some of these minerals are hosted by my country, which is DRC. So DRC accounts for 70% of the world cobalt. And this mineral is vital to the battery production. And cobalt demand is expected to double up to 2030 due to the global transition to renewable energy and electric vehicle. So, but by comparison, and strangely, there is a paradox, because in DRC, 84 million of people, which is around 80% of the total population in DRC, still will lack access to electricity power in 2030. So there is a rise up in demand of cobalt, and there is a willingness to accelerate the pace to electrical vehicle in the rest of the global world. But in the host country, while this strategic mineral is exploited, there will be no change as to what regards electricity. And this is an injustice. And that should raise question to strategic mineral end users about our moral, economic responsibility. How can we rethink this unbalanced value chain for that country? Because that country is strategic with this cobalt, but it's not only cobalt, it's also lithium. And moreover, and then you have the miner on the site in the Katanga Copper Belt, who doesn't know about COP26, who doesn't know about the next COP27, or who doesn't know what will be the impact of this conversation for him. Because they say, well, cobalt is said to be used by all the rest of the world, not only for electrical batteries, but also for phone that we all use. But I don't see my life changing. To the contrary, I see cobalt being out of my soul, and I don't see my environment and my community changing. And that is a real question. And I think if we want to see some success, and if we want to see support from all the African countries, and I say all the African countries because when I give the example of DRC, I consider that Africa, not only DRC, is the game changer. And that conversation has to take place and has to take place seriously. Because energy poverty in DRC and East Africa is not an option, and it's not a climate change solution. There are currently more than 600 million Africans without access to electricity, and they should not be forced to live in the dark because somewhere in Glasgow or somewhere they had been in conversation about their assets without them being involved. I'm speaking about minerals, but I can say the same for the Congo Basin. The Congo Basin absorbs 1.2 billion tons of CO2. And with the Amazonian forest, without these two resources, without these two forests, probably the world will feel warmer. Probably the temperature in the global world will be warmer, and so will be a threat and more dangerous. So this is things that needs to be understood and that needs to be put in the center of the conversation, because 600 million of Africans will live without electricity, and in the other world, US, China, and the European Union can keep using coal. So that's a paradox. There should be proportionate responsibility also, because that's part of the global answer or the global strategy. I think we must recognize the need for countries like DRC or other African countries to grow their economy and create jobs, to absorb also the huge need of these young people. If not, they don't find solution on their continent, and then we go in another issue, which is immigration. And we cannot accept that as parents, as leaders of the African continents. So there should be a proportionate responsibility, and that should be taken into account. When I speak about proportionate responsibility or climate justice, where does it come from? Is it coming from romantic posture of an African citizen speaking now today at Brookings, or is it based by facts? It's based by facts, because if I give some figures, I will say that 48 sub-Saharan African countries without South Africa, outside South Africa, are only responsible for just 0.5% of cumulative CO2 emission, while in the same time, China, European Union, and US emit over 40% of the total global greenhouse gases that give the balance. And that's what we call proportionate responsibility and climate justice. Coal still accounts for 38% of electricity generation worldwide, and especially in China, India, US, and the European Union. While at the same time, there is a motto and a ban about new coal manufacturing out of this geographical space. And there have been ideas about development finance where it says that development finance institutions should finance renewable energies initiative project pipeline in the rest of the world continent, especially in Africa, but not for coal. But it's also true that it's very difficult to develop and to fuel your industry just counting on renewable energy, wind and solar. And so we need to get access to universal energy so that we can really boost our economy and our industry in the African region and in the African continent. So that's really where the conversation is to my eyes. And I will also raise remarks to say that when I say that it's really figures and facts, and it's also business case and reality. Africa is really the game changer. We have demonstrated interesting success stories. Given time constraint, maybe I will not elaborate that now. But we have seen, for example, that Africa has 40% of the solar resource worldwide. but there is only 1% of solar investment on the African continent, while we've got 40% of the solar resource of the world. So this kind of issue needs to be well framed and well addressed on the next COP27. And regarding COP27, I will join my predecessor to say that we should go beyond the public statement and the handshakes at the end of night-long conversations. We should probably find tools like we have seen in trade agreements or international organizations. We should find binding tools so that everybody is accountable about the commitments they take. And then we will see some progress. We did it in United Nations, we did it at World Trade Organization. So we should find a sort of binding tools. Otherwise, we will just stockpile meetings about climate conversation, but we will not go to the phase of action. And for the time being, I will stop here, and we are open to probably debate on some of the information shared.
Honorable Mabunda, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the points you raised are absolutely compelling. The DRC accounts for a huge share of the world's rare earth, as you rightly mentioned. It also has the Congo Basin, which keeps the world from getting warmer and warmer, point well noted. And of course, the reminder that our continent accounts for 40% of the solar resources of this planet. And yet, here's the rub, as you put it, 600 million Africans today without electricity. So it's not a time for Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for more talk, as you put it, and consistent with what Mahmoud said. The world, as you put it, the world has, owes Africa a moral obligation, a moral responsibility to deliver for the children, to deliver for the women, to deliver for the men of the DRC and the continent as a whole. So I couldn't agree with you more, indeed. Ede, over to you.
Thank you so much. And now let's make a transition to the youth. Africa is the youngest continent, and the impacts of climate change are going to continue to grow, and they're going to be hardest when this bulge of young Africans will come into the marketplace, will come into their most productive years of their lives. And therefore, the role of the youth and the perspective of the youth are just fundamental. So we are very happy to have with us Nyombi Morris, youth climate activist in Uganda. So Nyombi, tell us a little bit more about what is it that youth organizations are doing in Uganda, and hopefully you can tell us also a little bit of Africa in general, to really engage in practical ways on climate action, how the challenges that Uganda faces on climate change relate to the actions and the movements that you're trying to put in place. Nyombi, please.
Thank you so much, Evie, for hosting me, and thank you for bringing up this conversation to me. Because today, as you said, Africa being with the highest number of young people that are actually interested even in climate change conversation, you need to mention that. Because one, in Uganda today, we have more than 50 activists that are not known by the world, and they are all on the front line. One of the biggest challenges we are facing today is unemployment, and also the cost of living after studies. Because once you are done with your, let's say, graduation or any course, your parents give up on you, and the next move is to look for a job. This is one of the biggest challenges that young people, once they are done with their education, they are forced again to go back and sit and again start to think what they can do. This is one of the biggest changes that we are bringing. You are seeing a lot of activists on front line taking action, demanding leaders who are also not willing to listen to them. Because today there's one of the projects in northern Uganda, in western Uganda, is called East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, and over 150,000 people have already been forced to evacuate to allow this pipeline to go through. This pipeline is being financed by Total, Standard Bank, and China. it started back then in 2015. For us, we have been growing, studying, and got to know it. That's how we came to challenge it. And because we have we are passionate for people and nature, we came out to speak up because we want to see a future which, our future shouldn't be for fossil or coal. No, we just want to be in a future that is full of renewable, and as they said, there is green economy. We want to see it, not just in words, because these very leaders are the ones who represented us at COP26, and they promised us a lot. But in the end, when you come back and see what is happening in my country, mining is increasing. Like when you go in northern part of Uganda, in northeastern part of Uganda, that is Karamoja region, there is a project for coal mining, and it has been happening for 2 decades now. Today, they can no longer receive sunshine, they can no longer, receive rainfall, in that women are being forced actually to, not even to, I call it what, the kind of dressing has changed totally because of the heavy sunshine that is up, and also the kind of food which they eat cannot allow their kids to come out very well. Malnutrition is at high rate because of one project that is being carried out in northeastern part of Uganda. And today they are facing another challenge of water crisis. As activists, we have been fundraising for that project, and because we don't have connections and maybe the power, we have failed to get the support. But since last year, we have been fundraising for that, to take water to that community, at least to that region, let them have something for survival, because today they are now coming to Kampala, where again, everything is costly. So as activists, we came out to challenge our government to act according to our will, and also to act on behalf of the people. This has caused us some negative feedbacks, in that we are receiving threats for only challenging what is not right. So sometimes we'll be like, you know what, just have to give up and let it go. But at COP27, the reason why it is in Africa is because they have seen the impacts are so much in global south and mostly Africa. So if they are sure there will be positive results, they need to frontline voices, mostly African voices, to make sure at least we are heard, because our countries are going through a lot. And in COP26 Glasgow, we are not given any opportunity. Even the number that represented us were the only those in governments. So this time around, as it is in Africa, we just want leaders to put aside the pledges, they have been sending out pledges. I remember even at COP26, Jeff Bezos promised $2 billion. Is it for protecting forests? I haven't seen that money up today. I remember, actually, I read it because I was young at 2009 Copenhagen, when they promised 100 billion. Today we had money because by then it was Obama who was leading, and this is Biden's regime. But we are still on the same thing. The money, the 100 billion. Where is it? The impacts in Uganda, they're happening. Last year, we lost over 1,800 people in flooding. It happened in June. It came back in August. This money would have helped us in building up better, but we never received the money. When you go to Algeria, there was wildfire. What happened after wildfire? Did people go back and follow up what happened, or they just ignore the impacts? When you go to Madagascar, there was devastating cyclone, and how many people tried to go back and follow up what is happening? Are people still surviving? How are they living? This is the money. If this money was approved in time, this country would be receiving the support they need in building resilience and setting up new structures. But now climate change is reshaping the continent, and we don't know what will happen, but we are worried on what we have seen so far. And this is just the beginning. When you go back to, again, last year in Mozambique, there was a devastating, like a severe drought, which left over 1 million like stuck. Like I don't know how to call it, but their survival, even right now, it is still wanting in that they are facing famine and the world is silent. So we are like, yes, you have accepted to bring COP27 in Africa. It seems like you have seen the impacts. What are you going to tell us this time? We are tired of promises. We are tired of pledges. Thank you.
Nyombi, thank you so much for those practical voices and for the actions that you're taking. I think that in the end, Africa is the young continent, and therefore it is the young voices that are going to change the situation altogether. And as you said, you raised the challenge to COP27, how to bring the voices of the youth more centrally to the conversation. Aloysius, back to you.
Thank you very much, Nyombi. That was really, really appreciated. Thanks, Ade. Let me turn now to Brother Okwe in Nairobi, right? What is the vision and the ambition of the IDRC, Kenya, Canadian governments? What's the big vision they're bringing to COP27 from where you sit? Given the enormity of the economic challenges we've just heard, compounded by COVID-19 as well, the recovery is going to be tough. What's IDRC doing in this climate space in Africa?
Thank you very much, Aloysius. And the previous speakers have very eloquently laid out the problems. And I think Mahmoud talked about COP27 at a high level. Now, for purposes of those who do not know the IDRC is the International Development Research Center. It's a public corporation created by the Parliament of Canada to help developing countries to use science, to use technology, to find solutions to the issues that the previous colleagues have highlighted, including environmental problems, social and economic problems. Now, just on a high level, we have over 15 years of continuous research investments in adaptation research, capacity building, leadership in the sphere of climate change. Now, going to COP27, we are aware, as Mohammed has said, we will be in Egypt this year. And for the first time, we have Canada having a national pavilion to showcase the commitments to amplify international support and to profile some Canadian leadership and innovation. Now, this pavilion will be informed by activities and ideas that have been generated by a host of institutions, including the IDRC. The IDRC will definitely be present at COP27. And you know that we are a knowledge-based organization. We provide evidence to address the issues that have been highlighted. And in this case, much of the evidence is aligned to the Canadian government's efforts to implement its climate priorities, as well as the breadth and diversity of the leadership of Canada in this sphere. Of course, Canada is not working alone. We're working in partnership with a host of other organizations. Now, our ambition in this particular case, first of all, as I said, we are going to use the evidence that we have generated over the past 15 years or so to provide responses to the issues that are highlighted in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and also looking at issues of global inequality. As Mahmoud highlighted, there are 4 complex challenges that we need to address, and all these have come more or less at the same time. We're talking about the fertilizer challenge, we're talking about the food prices, the fuel prices, and also the health challenge. We also are going to provide evidence to look at how countries can adapt through transformative work. Like I said, we are mainly action-based in terms of our research, and our work is going to contribute towards equitable, sustainable, and diverse food systems. We're looking at systems that will build the resilience of communities to stand in times of difficulty on issues caused by climate change. And like I said, some of these issues affect, for example, health. There are serious health issues that are related to climate change. And among these, for example, we have a specific partnership with the United Nations, the United Kingdom's government on a climate adaptation and resilience program. And the other aspect that we're looking at is we want to build partnerships. We want to work and go the longer mile rather than working in isolation. We've talked about the pledges, we've talked about the announcements with no delivery. But I think all this delivery will come if we work together as a partnership. So IDRC is looking out for coalitions to amplify the knowledge that we have generated to address the climate change issues so that we become more sustainable, more inclusive, and also we want to reduce increase the resilience of some of these countries. Just maybe in a nutshell again, some of the core items that we work with, we have the people like Nyombi who are focusing on youth response to climate change. So we want to strengthen the capacities of youth organizations, key policymakers to develop innovative approaches for transitions that will help low-income countries. We are also looking at identifying climate impact hotspots and prioritizing efforts. How can we do this? We, again, want to work with like-minded development partners, national governments, and also looking at the international community. And maybe finally, looking at it from the aspect of the women youth, we want to look at how we can test and scale interventions that can be responsive in terms of policy, in terms of program, in terms of private sector innovations that can promote the economic opportunities for the vulnerable groups. Our emphasis is inclusion and supporting the opportunities for the vulnerable groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Over to you, Ede.
So, Mahmoud, I want to follow up on a topic that I know is very important to you, that is really breaking silos. Because you have worked for many years on the SDG agenda. And when I go around in countries in Africa, there seems to be these parallel discourses and action on SDGs and climate. And there are different ministries, different working groups, different perspectives. And they are both looking for further financing. So in the report that I co-directed and was launched in COP26 on the state and trends in climate adaptation in Africa, and we calculated in the NDCs of Africa, the needs of what the countries are saying for climate action is about $33 billion a year. And the reality is that only about $6 billion are coming to the continent. The African countries in their NDC says, look, we have another $6 billion, but that gives you a gap of more than $20 billion a year in terms of financing. And therefore, if you were to pick one or two, three really interesting initiatives and action that needs to be accelerated and scaled up to mobilize more financing for Africa in that combination of SDGs and climate, what are your thoughts? What is your perspective given everything and the broad panorama that you see on financial ideas out there? What do you like?
Right. Well, that's one of your trickiest questions and tough ones, because it has first something to do with the very design of the SDGs. You remember when the SDGs were designed after the MDGs, SDG 13 was put in its own bracket or its own bucket without really connecting it much to the rest of the SDGs. Even the details were not there. They just say they're refer to the climate action and the UNFCCC. That's fantastic. But then when you say something about the investments required based on these insightful comments by colleagues in the panel, it's all about investments in variety of SDGs. If it is about energy, if it's about water, if it's about job opportunities, all of that is basically about the rest of the SDGs. And here, those three famous investments, how to do that, the investment in human capital, investment in infrastructure, including digital, and investment in resilience need to be put together. So beyond that kind of framework, how can you deal with it? First, it's the leadership at each country level that should really recognize that the silent approach is not going to be helpful. It's going to be facing us with coordination problems, and we have overlapping issues, and we may need to do better job in order to mobilize resources if we have this kind of fragmented approach. So there is a leadership, could be president, could be head of government, could be a group of ministers, leaders from at the subnational level as well from the communities. That gets me into the level that you worked a lot on issues related to the subnational, local communities and all of that. Here the silos would be broken more. If you are working like this Decent Life program in Egypt, trying to improve lives and livelihoods at the village level, here you cannot really work siloed approach. First, because there is a budget constraint. Second, that you need to go into that village and do the proper job in dealing with what this village requires. So the responsive approach here will be really get us this kind of a more holistic approach. Then the ultimate thing, which is really missing, that I'm not aware, and please, I stand to be corrected, if you are aware of one country that had SDG budgeting approach what they do. You have the visions, you have the priority set, Vision 2030, you have the voluntary national reviews, but they are not costed. And even if they are costed, they are not budgeted for. So perhaps here, this could be a good opportunity, because we are talking here about huge transformational budgets that requires really a lot of work at the budget level. And if it is not on the budget, it doesn't exist. So here you need to really start where it matters, the budget of the state and the budget of the communities, the municipalities. And here, before you ask the business community what they can do for you, the issues related to domestic resource mobilization and the costing of the SDGs, you can see what you can do with the public purse, and then you can bring the private sector, the IFIs to do that kind of work. Comes to mind, and to your specific question on the projects, I can see more on the nexus approach on water, electricity, and food system. There are many projects now that are being submitted, including renewable energy component, including a better water management component, and linking that all to food. That is a variety of projects that gets us into breaking silos between ministries of agriculture, ministries of supplies, ministries of electricity and energy, and definitely the local development kind of ministries, but with all of with their partners. Of projects that I can see the opportunities, straightforward, not really tough to replicate, are basically the projects that are based on solar energy with its two competing technologies. But you pick the technology that you like, and then you can really see the partnerships between the public side and the private sector side on that. Then came to mind as well, variety of local development kind of projects, women-led projects in villages, with young women included, that had really a variety of different approaches. But here it's basically more funded through the philanthropists, because you can see here my message. There is a comparative advantage of the dollar coming from the public purse. There is another comparative advantage from the dollar coming from the private sector portfolio. And there is that newcomer in the field with big scale from the philanthropists that can really do a good work in funding or bridging gaps, or at least playing a kind of a catalyst role. Back to you.
Thank you, Mahmoud. I really like this idea of really mobilizing financing to break silos. These initiatives that really are at the core of the link between agriculture, water, energy, and climate, so that multiple sources of funding can come in. And then the message of, look, every source of funding has a comparative advantage. So don't think of every dollar being the same no matter where they come. The private sector has an advantage, the public sector has an advantage, the IFIs and the philanthropies have different advantages. So understanding and unpacking that those priorities, I think, is going to be fundamental to really bring those two agendas, SDGs and climate, closer together to achieve the objectives. Because as I say, the little progress that is being made on SDGs is like 2 steps forward, and after a climate shock is a step backward. And therefore, achieving the SDGs is going to be a lot more difficult as the impacts of climate change increase rapidly over the years to come. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ede and Mahmoud. Let me now turn to Madam Janine Mabunda. Even on this panel today and what we've been hearing globally, we hear the youth voices. We hear the voices of women. We hear the voices of governments and the private sector. One voice we don't commonly hear about is in this climate debate is the voices of parliamentarians, of which you are one. So you have a unique role in the climate action as the legislative branch of government. What are your thoughts on the ideal roles and actions that Africa's parliamentarians should take to help countries get ready for the impacts of climate change?
Thank you, and I think you raise it because in each parliament now it's more and more common to see subcommission work group dedicated to environment issue, and the DRC is not an exception. We have an environment commission at the National Assembly, and they have been very active and very innovative in their dialogue about the issue. I think it's not just about law, because law can take time and they are much needed, but it's also about sensitization, education, and renewed dialogue with all the stakeholders. I will give an example. We have now some of my colleagues which are on the field in the Katanga Copper Belt to discuss with the mining industry or some mining operators to make sure that their activities is environment friendly and that they are coping with the rules, local rules, provincial rules, and national rules that needs to be complied to. That's an example. I also think that we look as local parliament, MPs, people, member of parliament for DRC, but we have also international or regional parliament organization where this issue are also now addressed. I'll take, for example, the Francophonie Parliament, where all the parliamentarians speaking French are getting together regularly. That's an example, but I can also cite the African Union. African Union has been on the forefront in addressing new crises that the African region is seeing and meeting, and environment is one of it. Environment is one of it, and I think it's very important. When some of my predecessors raised the issue about how COP27 cannot be a talk shop again, and I raised by habit as a parliamentarian, I raised one of the solutions. And one of the solutions was to say, let's find binding tools like we have in other international organizations to lead all stakeholders, to lead all countries to comply with its own commitment. I like the intervention of our young brothers, Nyombi Morris, who says, well, there have been this big American company owner who said that he will invest $2 billion. And since he is following all the COP26 and the next 27, Morris has not yet seen how this pledge commitment has been implemented. So as a parliamentarian from Congo, but also from all this regional forum, East Africa Forum or African Union Forum, we should make sure maybe in preparing the unique tools, whether it's by rules and laws or fiscal incentive or fiscal penalties, but we should come out with some proposal to make sure that this time it's not just talk show, but it can be followed with consequences by rule of law if it's not respected.
Thank you very much, Madam Mabunda. Ede, over to you.
Thank you so much. Nyombi, in the African continent, when you look at the political leadership, you don't see as many youth as in other countries. And if youth is not part of the political leadership, then change becomes sometimes more difficult, particularly on climate change. What are your thoughts on how to change that situation? Do you see hope? Do you see countries where the youth are becoming more active into that political leadership side, and through that being able to change action on climate? Or what are other interesting and successful avenues that you are seeing with your colleagues and youth activists around the region on that process?
This is a good question, by the way, because it's not like they don't usually ask it. As I said in my last speak, I was trying to show you the image that in my country, even challenging what is wrong, you receive threats. Either they want to kidnap you or arrest you. So when you talk about political leadership, we are all interested in that. Even me, I would like to take the lead because I'm already a leader on ground, because we have projects and have organizations that we are running already. We are doing some grassroots work, and I've been doing this since 2019, and I've been speaking up, and I'm not like they are not ready to listen to us. Whenever we be like, okay, if you can't listen to us, we are going to take that, like we are going to stand up and take political leadership. They threaten us, like they come up with like a lot of limits. They can end up asking you papers where you haven't even reached. That is a challenge which is stopping us from engaging in political elections and everything. But in other countries, it is okay. But here in Africa, when they see that you are so much interested in it, they make sure they put limits that will not allow you contest, or they threaten you. Because we have one of the political, like is an opposition leader, is known as Bobi Wine, and he's a youth who just grew up from ghetto, and we have seen what they have been, how he has been treated ever since he came out to contest. So even as we fear, like at least for him, he has like he got the attention, the world knows him. But for us, you fear, like you be like, what if they come for me? What if they come for my family? That is the only challenge. But we are interested because we are already leaders and we are already leading. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that future and really being able to work even in an environment of fear is so important. So thank you for the work that you do, Nyombi. Aloysius.
Indeed, thank you. Thank you very much, Nyombi, for those what you've just shared. We'll make sure that we reach out to you and your community and your peers when we come to launch Foresight in Kampala. Those are very interesting views to hear. Let me now turn to Paul Okwe again. In this year's Foresight, Paul, one of the viewpoints was from Sierra Leone, Freetown, where the city mayor, Madam Yvonne Aki-Saye, advocates that local African governments and city administrations should be empowered to do more on the climate issue. You talked about in your earlier remarks IDRC support for women, IDRC support for youths. What is IDRC doing in terms of supporting cities on the climate challenge?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ordu. And IDRC has a multiple approach to supporting cities, not only cities, but think tanks and organizations and governments in terms of addressing the climate change issues. And from our perspective, I think we could take this on from a three-pronged approach, knowing that the cities are more of the implementation-based, or they're actually on the ground in terms of understanding the consequences and feeling the effects of the implications of climate change. First of all, IDRC is more of, like I said, knowledge-based, but we use this knowledge to support decisions that are made at national, regional, and then also at the local level. In our case, what I would think about as some of the core entry points, first of all, is we support early action. We support interventions that focus on prevention and strengthening resilience at the city level. And our emphasis as an organization that works on action research is to take the knowledge down to the lowest levels, to the users of this information. Our emphasis is to what extent has our information as knowledge been taken for use. Number two is that we also work together with the cities to support those in fragile environments, those who need immediate support, for example, safety net programs. And in our case, again, we try to provide intervention mechanisms. We do not provide the interventions themselves, but we provide useful inputs in terms of approaches, in terms of methodologies for reaching out to the poorest of the poor, and also to support those who are like the youth who are not actually benefiting from some of the mitigation and approaches. The third approach, the third thing that we use is trying to use more advocacy and encouraging political commitment. As you realize, most of the commitments are done at the national level, and less is done at the city level or municipal level or local council level. So as IDRC, through the projects that we work with, we tend to go 3-4 steps lower to the lowest unit of utilization, sharing this information, helping the cities to mobilize resources, providing direct support, and providing coordination mechanisms between the researchers, the think tanks, and the alternative systems. So in terms of the looking at it from the medium to the long-term aspects, we are also looking at contributing meaningfully in terms of development planning for these cities. What can be done by these cities in terms of long-term visions for mitigation of climate? And here again, we do not have access to direct resources for investment, but we use our strength, which is knowledge generation, policy influence, and innovative research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Over to you, Ede.
I think that we have a little bit of time for questions from our audience. So, Mahmoud, there's an interesting question that we'd love to hear your thoughts on, and that is the topic on climate justice. And you mentioned it briefly, the question of just transition. But just transition not only on what to do from coal and fossil fuels into other types of generation, but also the just transition of African communities and households that are subject to these regular climate shocks, and a transition that allows them to become more adapted and more resilient. The climate justice between countries that historically have been doing the large majority of the greenhouse gas emissions versus Africa that not only today, but historically has had a minuscule proportion of those greenhouse gas emissions. Your thoughts on these topics and the recent evolution on climate justice and just transition, and how do you see that coming to COP27 over the next few months?
Right. Thank you so much. And I'm happy that this particular topic, I see it twice in the initiatives supported by the presidency of COP27. So if I'm not covering everything, the material that will be coming in the next days about the initiatives, including the one related to just investment and another one about just energy transition, could be really of reference. There are two of the initiatives out of 17, and there is something as well that I think that piece by the Honorable Mabunda on issues related to addressing African dual challenges, when she referred to issues related to conflict because of mismanagement, when she said rising sea levels as one of the impacts of climate change. Africa will grapple with drought, potential conflicts of water access. And that could be even more compounded if the transition is not really taking into consideration the initial conditions, the political economy dynamics, the alternatives to what could really be provided for the community. It could be easier technically to move out from coal or from other sources with high emission and get us into renewables through new investments and technology. But the impacted community is in need for addressing its issues as well. So that's why, without really getting too much into the details, people celebrated early that famous project in South Africa, the phasing out from coal, the phasing in renewables, and dealing with the communities, because it had the three elements of almost everything. You are doing mitigation, you are getting into a more sustainable source of energy, and the highlight of the whole thing is basically about this issue of the community impact, because there are people who are dependent in the ecosystem of coal. It's not just the miners or the companies, but there is a whole system that is dependent on that. And there is a challenge that when you are dealing with these kind of issues, it's not just a locational matter, because if you are going to be dealing with that community that's being impacted, the opportunity for job may not really be with the same neighborhood. So there is going to be some sort of serious impact on families, households, their connections, and the cost of living and all of that. So this kind of, again, gets us back to this holistic approach that we're talking about. So taking it from energy, yes, of course, on the energy side, we need really to have this kind of managing the transition efficiently and fairly and squarely. This is great. But taking it from the just perspective, and basically about who's going to be as well taking the burden of this kind of transition. Africa alone cannot really fund all of these projects. And as I said earlier, we reached a debt burden that we cannot go beyond. Even if you can afford it and the cost is fine, it's not really fair for me to borrow long-term or short-term to fix problems that you caused. So I think there is the spirit of partnership here, which is SDG 17, bringing the SDGs into action. It's basically about this issue of partnership and operationalizing it in a meaningful way. I have a project, just energy transition or fair transition energy, but it will have an impact. Who is going to be bearing the cost of all of that? Well, it's a kind of a collaborative approach that needs to be resolved. And we reach limits in budget and we reach limits in borrowing. So I think there are two alternatives here, very practically. One, it has to be more investment-based approach, because I'm not really assuming that all of the compensations through the loss and damage is going to be sufficient to deal with what we are after here of huge infrastructure projects. Great if it happens, but what if it doesn't? What if it takes more time? So I think long-term concession could be the second best. Third, swaps, debt reduction, this could really be helpful, but that needs more work. And as I said, I'm relying on lots of good work that could come from you and your colleagues at Brookings and some investment banks who are interested in this topic as well.
Mahmoud, you gave me a segue to ask then a question on a topic that we haven't talked too much in this panel to Madame Janine Mabunda, and that you raised in your piece in Foresight, which is this issue of fragility and conflict, not only at the national level, but also at the subnational and community level, where the climate shocks are, even if they're not the sole source of the fragility and conflict, they are a really important amplifying factor that may work on that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how those two agendas and the fact that there are so many situations, unfortunately, of fragility and conflict in the continent, how can they be dealt together in a way that leverages solutions that become more practical? Your thoughts on that?
The question is for me, yeah?
Yes.
Yes, I think you raise it, and especially when you think about the advantageous assets of the continent and their contribution to the next energetic transition. And usually it happens in areas which are landlocked, poor, eventually subject to conflict because there is conflict and power race, or there is competition about illegal access to these resources, because for some people they are very returning, and that's where the challenge is. I always said or raise the question, let's close our eyes and imagine that there will be no cobalt in the rest of the world, just in Africa, and that Africa, and especially the DRC, decides for whatever reason that there is no more access to its cobalt. It will be a nightmare, because no more electrical vehicle, no more electronical tools, and that's really how we should see the pictures. Because, like I said, it's very difficult for Katanga Copper Belt mining diggers to understand this sophisticated conversation we have about energetic transition, and to realize and to be aware where he is that these commodities, this raw material, is very key and very returning in the rest of the world, while for himself it doesn't mean anything and it doesn't change the life of his family. And that's where we are in this cycle of conflict sometimes. And I think it's very important to get a better balanced sense about how, without being extremists in both sense, either from the private sector, either from the community, it will make justice to get a more balanced approach. I may not understand, for example, it has been said that the price of the cobalt when you dig it in some host countries, up to when it comes to become cobalt battery for electrical vehicle, the difference of price can go multiplied by 20. And is it fair? Is it fair for the host community where this raw material has been exploited? No, we also know that mining is a very complex activity with a lot of challenge and charges. But I think this conversation has to happen. If we want to see this energetic transition with what we call these key materials for the energetic transition, this conversation has to happen. Otherwise, I suspect that we will face the kind of dualistic approach we experienced in the late 70s, where it was about the Middle East country with the oil, where they say, well, it's all oil, but we do not understand. We are not able to leverage it on an acceptable way on the international stage, and then they create OPEC. So I think that the conversation, lesson from the past, should drive us to be more smart, because we can avoid this error, to be more agile, and there should be acceptable business models where all the stakeholders can find their way. We see today, for example, that more and more in the mining industry where these energetic minerals should be used, or in the telecom industry, but the mining industry is more self-speaking and is making, I think, a big step. We see that more and more they try to develop very balanced, like you say, and very seasoned tools about energy delivery. Yes, they need delivery. They need energy for the activity of the mine. In the past, maybe they use thermal energy, but this day they rather go to see whether they can do hybrid system. And everybody now is speaking about hybrid system, where some part of renewable energy can help and contribute to the life of the mine. And I think that this kind of example shows that when there is a strong demand from the stakeholders, from the communities, from the regulators, it's because there is this strong pressure on them, because they are more visible, that this effort has been made. So if we take example in that sector, we can replicate it in other area. We see also that there have been some international coalition, because they hear about this need of climate justice, energy justice. And we have seen, for example, that there have been a global alliance partnership I think it was in 2017 at the closing of some Davos forum. And this kind of initiative just shows that we all want to progress, but we have understood that it's difficult to progress alone. Yes. We have to move that conversation in a team building way. Otherwise, you cannot pretend that you will leave some people behind while basically some of the strategic resources we need belongs to them. It won't be possible.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Look, Aloysius, we're coming to the end of this panel. I think that it has been such a rich, diverse set of perspectives, from the COP27 leadership to parliamentarians to youth voices to knowledge for policy and action organizations. So I think that combination is really unique. And I really want to thank the panelists, not only for the time, but for the passion and the ideas that you have shared with all of us. Aloysius, you have the final word to close.
Ede. Thank you, Ede, and thanks for all our panelists. I think it's really, really difficult to summarize everything we heard here today. I think a number of things really resonated to me. Back in 2008, 2009, we were facing the triple crisis of food, fuel, and financial crisis. Today, especially in Africa, we're facing 5 Fs now. Food, fuel, financial, particularly debt. We're facing fertilizer crisis and, of course, flooding that is devastating many of our communities. So that came out very strongly. The need to narrow the gap between climate financing and SDG financing, because climate change is really about opportunities to operationalize the SDGs. I think that came out very, very strongly. The need to focus on projects, not promises. The countries need to ensure bankable projects, good investment climate, and regulatory regimes to attract investments in these projects. We heard that loud and clear. And as Ede just mentioned, youths, women's groups, parliamentarians, we all need to be mobilized, particularly for Africa's COP, and to speak with one voice and stay on message as we approach Sharm el-Sheikh. That also came out very, very strongly. We also heard the overarching theme of moral responsibility. I think the idea that Congo DRC accounts for a huge share of the world's rare earth, that the Congo DRC has the Congo Basin, the lung of the world, that keeps us from getting warmer. And yet, over 600 million Africans are in the dark, literally, have no electric power to make progress and development. So the world has a moral obligation to deliver for our children as we go forward. And that's part of the message we've heard as we go towards Africa's COP in Egypt. Mahmoud, Nyombe, Janine, Paul, and Ede, thank you very, very much for choosing to spend this morning with us. We are very, very grateful to each and every one of you. Have a wonderful day. I'm Aloysius Uche Ordu. This has been Foresight Africa. To learn more about what you heard today, find this episode online at brookings.edu/Foresight Africa podcast. Each episode will be listed on its own webpage, and there will be links to the content discussed in the episode. The Foresight Africa podcast is brought to you by the Brookings Podcast Network. Learn more at brookings.edu/podcasts. Send your feedback and questions to podcast@brookings.edu. My thanks to the production team, including Fred Dews, producer, Timara White and Christina Golubski, associate producers, Gaston Riboredo, audio engineer, and Sky Sutton, audio intern. The show's art was designed by Shavanti Mendez, based on a concept by the creative firm Blossom. Additional support for this podcast comes from David Bachek, Ramen Prit Kaur, Ian McAllister, Chris McKenna, Soren Mesner Zaidel, Chris Peters, Andrea Risotto, Esther Rosen, and Ashley Wood Schelling. Thank you very much.